Hey everyone, it's Reed. Thanks as always for listening. When you're done here, do not leave until you've given this podcast a 5-star rating. Guys, the ratings make sure other people can find these conversations, other people can tune in, and other people can get involved. I hope when you're done here, you'll give us a 5-star rating. And thanks again for listening. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Markovits, the Guido Calabrese Professor of Law at Yale Law School and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Private Law. He is published widely and in a range of disciplines, including law, philosophy, and economics. His writings have appeared in Science, the American Economic Review, the Yale Law Journal, PNAS, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and the Atlantic. His latest book, published in 2019, and possibly now more relevant than ever, is The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite, which is available wherever fine books are sold. Today, he's coming to us from New Haven, Connecticut. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Reed. It's a real pleasure to be here.
You released the book in 2019, which means you probably started writing it sometime in 2017 or 2018, pre-pandemic, pre-COVID. Has anything about the nature of what you wrote or your belief changed in the wake of a global pandemic, an election of Joe Biden, a re-election of Donald Trump, and the world as it is today?
I actually started writing it long before 2017. So I probably started writing it in a sense in the 1990s. And we can talk about that at some point if people are interested. In terms of changes, I would say two things. One sort of reconfirms or, in fact, increases the salience of my central thesis. And one gives me a little bit of pause. The one that reconfirms is that COVID and the pandemic, particularly in the United States, had a massive and devastating consequence for educational inequality. Middle class and working class kids in the U.S. lost between half and 3/4 of a year of school to the pandemic. And I don't mean that they didn't go and didn't have full-time classes. I meant that they had that number of school days with no contact at all with their school. Whereas the richest kids lost 0 days because their schools, if they were in private schools, simply stayed open with quarantining and testing. And often, even if they couldn't stay open physically, had extremely built out distance learning capacities. And so educational inequality got even worse during the pandemic along meritocratic lines in ways that exactly parallel or exacerbate the phenomena that I describe in the book. The other thing that gives me a little bit of pause is, one of the central arguments of the book is that the structural problems we're facing as a society today are mostly caused by the mass elite, not by oligarchs. And one of the things that's happened in the past few years with, the way in which Bezos has started interacting with politics, the way in which Mark Zuckerberg has started interacting with politics, and in particular, Elon Musk and his association with the current administration, leads me to think that oligarchs are maybe more important than I had credited and have a malign influence.
Well, yeah, because they didn't get to this place by being thinking about the greater good, especially when at least two of the people you mentioned are trying to figure out how to get away from the planet rather than solving the problems we have here. And the other one is spouting off about you might have 3 real friends in your actual life, but we want to give you 15 AI friends on Facebook or Meta or whatever, which I just cannot see working out for individuals or the society writ large. But let's talk about the mass elite. And look, I live in a very exclusive, wealthy enclave. Most of the people I know went to college. Their kids, for the most part, are going to go to college. And there is also sort of a checklist, for lack of a better way to put it, Daniel, of like, you have to go to this school, you have to take these AP classes, you have to do these volunteer activities, you have to have a college resume, you have to do this well on the SAT or the ACT, and we're going to get all the tutors necessary to make those things happen. So that you can go to school A, B, or C, so that you can check the next box that then gives you that professional, information services job, professional services job, anything, frankly, but manufacturing, trades, whatever. So then maybe you could go to graduate school for an MBA or a law degree, or maybe if you want to be a doctor. And so it just becomes this continuing rollout of being credentialed by those same elites that we've come up around.
That's the phenomenon that the book describes, and it is ongoing, and it is not relaxing. The effect of it and the tension of it is growing. And one important thing to understand about it is that it stands in a very complicated relationship to claims of justice in the following sense. For that system to be legitimated, it also has to be the case that talented, super talented outsiders can break in. Because if they can't break in, then the claims of the meritocratic evaluation system are immediately exposed as being simply false. And the way in which the system retains its legitimacy is by being true in a way. And evidence of its truth is that talented outsiders are admitted in. And one thing that we're seeing in elite schools and universities, particularly in response to right-wing populism, is a greater effort is being made to identify the most talented outsiders and recruit and draw them into these institutions. And that effort is somewhat successful. That is to say, the share of Pell Grant recipients at the most elite universities has gone up in the past 5 or 10 years. But here's what's fascinating about it. And we don't have the full data yet, although I'm convinced that this is true. The outsiders have mostly taken places that were previously allocated to the middle class. So the share of students at Harvard or Princeton or Yale or Stanford who come from real privilege has not decreased a lot, even as the share of students at those schools who come from at or below the poverty line has increased. And the people who've been squeezed are the middle class. And that's politically incredibly damaging for a society because it leads the broad middle class to conclude that the society's elite institutions are a conspiracy of the rich and the poor against them, and then to lose faith in those institutions. And one of the ways in which to understand this sort of fuel that's been thrown on the flame of populism is that precisely the efforts of the elite to open itself up have only exacerbated the exclusion of the broad middle of society and caused greater resentment than before.
I just want to go back for 1 second because when you said outsider, I was assuming you were discussing lower socioeconomic people. In your calculus there, what's your definition of outsider?
So I use the word generally to pick up that there are two kinds of phenomena here. One is a diversity, equity, and inclusion phenomenon, which is around identity politics, around categories other than class. And, elite institutions have embraced diversity significantly out of a good faith and, I believe, morally correct view that there's enormous structural inequality around race and other identity categories still in our society, and that we as a society have a moral duty to correct it. But it's also the case that embracing that kind of diversity is actually helpful to the self-interest of the elite institutions because it warrants their meritocratic credentials. We'll take people regardless of their race if they achieve highly enough. And so it's both a principled commitment and it's also something that's actually in the interest of those institutions. Similarly, with respect to class, as the political winds have blown against racial, ethnic, other forms of diversity based on identity categories, elite institutions have turned towards class. And again, it's a sincere commitment. And, the poor in the United States are much, much poorer than the poor in other rich countries. And it's a moral disgrace. And elite institutions should open themselves up to people who are economically excluded. But once again, it helps leaven the meritocratic cake, and it doesn't actually serve the interests of the broad middle class. And in the long run, it doesn't serve the political interests of the society.
I would also say that if you are part of the credentialed class and you strongly believe that your children both need to be and deserve to be part of that class, there could be a desire, whether or not it's just in your own head or you're doing whatever, to say, well, but my kid deserves to go there more than anybody else does, right? Like I went to Stanford, my kid deserves to go to Stanford. I went to Harvard, my kid's like, well, what do you mean my kid didn't get in because you have to let somebody else in? Why is that fair?
Yes, that's true. And when you see things like the Varsity Blues scandal, the scandals in which rich families have basically been committing illegal forms of corruption to get their children admitted, you see that effect in operation. But I also wanna emphasize that mostly elites, when they are told by these institutions, "Sorry, your kid didn't get in," accept it. The main way in which elites outcompete everybody else is that they've learned that they can co-opt the rules and play within them and get their kids in within the rules by hiring tutors, sending them to expensive private schools, and having their kids win the competition rather than cheating. And it's important to understand that the main driver of the continued dynastic privilege of elite families in the United States today is not the cheating driver. It's the playing by the rules driver, but the rules favor the rich.
Right. Back to the title of your book about this sort of foundational myth of the U.S., right, is the American dream. You work hard, you play by the rules, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. When I was a Republican years ago, that was sort of the thing. But even like William F. Buckley, right, who was a huge, believer in said thing, right, like had to have his dad publish his book, right, and start his magazine. So a lot of times, too, the people who are projecting on this ideal or this myth are not the ones who actually have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps every morning.
Look, there are two different ways to understand pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. One is literally the bootstrap story, which is that you make your own fortune. And so you don't get a lot of help from the outside. And through some combination of luck, character, and talent, you nevertheless manage to get ahead. And that's the story of Horatio Alger of the American dream. And that story is rarer and rarer and rarer if you just look empirically at the data on social mobility. And also, by the way, rarer in the United States today than in countries like Germany or Scandinavian countries. But there's another version of this, which is that even if you're born with some privilege, nowadays you have to participate in the reproduction of your privilege by working pretty hard yourself. And so one of the things that leads elites today to believe that they deserve more than they do is that there's a sense in which they have worked hard to get where they are, even though they also got a lot of support. Both things can be true at once. And that produces a kind of distortion of political psychology in which the rich focus on the effort that they've committed, on the sweat equity that they have in their own lives and successes, and allow it to cloud the advantage, their vision of the advantages that they also have.
So how do you begin to unwind this? The idea was, and so many other pieces of this, from my perspective, Daniel, seem to be coming to an end. The 80 years of post-war America, I think they probably ended a while ago, but the nails seem to be in the coffin now, which was millions of men coming home from overseas, some going to college on the GI Bill and, building their families and building the middle class from that. Others, maybe they worked in factories, but there was a strong union base. You could be an organized worker. You could work one job. You could have a family. Again, the whole concept of your kids having a better life than you. That seems to fall by the wayside, but we still hold to this myth of the American dream, that the American dream is possible for anyone. So if it's not the case anymore, how do we start to recreate a system and a country in which that middle class is not contracting, but we're halting that contraction and beginning expansion?
So I think there are two places that we need to intervene. One is at school. There's been actually quite a lot of progress in American education in closing both the investment gap and the achievement gap between the middle class and the poor. So through a variety often of state, legal, and political initiatives, the financing for the poorest schools has increased relative to middle class schools, and the relative achievement of poor kids and middle class kids has gotten closer over the past 50 years or so. But at the same time, the investment and achievement gaps between the middle class and the rich have exploded. So that today, for example, an average middle-class American school might spend between, say, $15,000 and $18,000 a year educating every kid in it, whereas a really poor school might spend $8,000 to $10,000. The richest schools spend $75,000. So the rich middle-class gap is now about 15 times as big as the middle-class poor gap. And this produces enormous differences in academic achievement. So that on the SAT, the average kid whose parents make over $200,000 a year scores about 250 points higher than the average median income kid, the average middle class kid, even as the average middle class kid scores only about 125 points higher than the average kid at or below the poverty level. So the first thing we have to do in school, and this runs through college too, is we have to democratize and open up elite education by diluting the enormous investments that are made in the richest kids, by encouraging through a combination of carrots and sticks, elite schools to open their doors and educate many, many more children so that the resources in other schools can be spread less thinly, and so that the gap between the rich and everybody else shrinks. And that's on the education side, that's the first thing we have to do. We also have to make some changes in the workplace, but education is the place to start.
So if a poor school district is spending $8,000 to $10,000 a year per kid, let's just stay steady for inflation and all that other stuff, right? That over the course of 10 years, you've spent $100,000 on that kid, okay? In a rich school district, that means you've spent $750,000 on that kid. And you could make an argument that that pretty much lines up with the kind of house you could afford after you get out of college.
Totally. And remember that the poor kid doesn't go to college.
Right.
And the rich kid goes to college. And an elite college spends well north of $100,000 a year educating every one of its students. And then the rich kid goes to medical school for another 7 years, or law school for another 3 years, or business school for 2 more years, or graduate school. So here's a way to think about it. The old aristocratic elite passed its privilege down to its children by dying and leaving bequests of land or factories or something like that. So imagine you do the following thought experiment. Instead of investing in his kid's education, imagine that in every year you took the difference between the amount that is invested in educating a typical kid from the richest 1% of American households and in educating a middle-class kid. So the rich middle-class gap, not the middle-class poor gap. And you took that amount and you put it in the S&P 500 to create a trust fund to give as an inheritance to the rich kid when their parents die. That sum, that trust fund, would end up containing somewhere between $10 and $15 million per child. And so that's the transmission of privilege through the mechanism of extremely intense and expensive education that the system that we've constructed allows rich families to pass down to their kids. And of course, kids who get all that investment in their education are going to do really well in life because education works. And they're then going to dominate the top jobs in the next generation, and the cycle will just continue.
Let me ask you this. In your research, why is it that education as a concept is so often belittled in the United States when it so clearly has tangible, quantifiable, and undoubtedly positive impacts on a person's life?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. There are very different sets of reasons. So one set of reasons is that in the United States, actually, unlike in most other rich countries, we have a sector of lightly regulated and really unscrupulous for-profit post-high school education, which does not serve the people who go to it well. These are people who go to for-profit schools and study in fields or in schools that have no reasonable prospect of getting them employment afterwards, and then end up in enormous debt, which incidentally is not even dischargeable in bankruptcy in the United States. So it's lifelong student debt. And they basically get screwed by the system. And they're vivid and clear. And what happens to them, to some degree, carries over to the rest of the system. Because actually, most colleges in the United States are a pretty good deal for the kids that go through them. In fact, many of them are an outstanding deal for the kids that go through them. So that's one thing that's going on. I think the other thing that's going on is that, especially at our most elite colleges, the things that they are teaching the people who go through them increasingly yield skills that mostly serve the elite. So, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Stanford send huge numbers of their graduates into finance, elite law, and big tech. And it's very dubious that any of those three sectors of our economy is doing much to make the lives of ordinary people better.
Right. Well, they don't make anything. You could make the argument that the tech people build something, but it's this.
It's this, but also it's even more than this piece of hardware. It's the software and the extractive networks on it. So what they're mostly building these days is systems that suck us in, distract our attention, and create opportunities for other people to take our money. And finance makes finance sector workers rich, but does not necessarily benefit the real economy particularly, certainly not in proportion to the wealth it generates. And elite law is the same. And so the rest of society sees these people going through these universities and they're getting all these skills, but the skills they're getting are mostly skills that then serve them rather than serve all of us. And that obviously does not increase the affection or the reputations of the institutions that give these skills.
What you've just described is a near bifurcation in American society, economically, socially, educationally, financially. I might have said that, right? Which is the only time one of these elites comes into contact with someone not of their caste is in probably a service sector, the back of an Uber, the deli counter, a store they're shopping at. But that's a transitory interaction, right? I find the yoga pants, I buy the yoga pants, I leave and I wear the yoga pants, and I go with my elite friends to the yoga studio to do hot yoga with my other elite friends.
Yeah, look, one other thing that's happened over the past 50 years is that we have become enormously more socioeconomically segregated. If you look at demographers' indices of household similarity by income and education, those have gone way up over the past 50 years. So the share of households next to me who have the same income level or the same education level as I have has increased dramatically. If you look at the concentration of elite degree holders in a small number of cities or zip codes, that has increased dramatically. And then surrounding that geographic phenomenon, plus, if you look at also the share of college degree holders who marry other college degree holders, so household formation is becoming more segregated. Plus, these systems and the wealth they've produced have now created an ecosystem of privilege so that the foods that people eat, the cars that they drive, the clothes that they wear, the restaurants that they go to, the books and magazines that they read have all changed. 50 years ago, there wasn't Whole Foods. And so everybody went to Safeway. And maybe if you lived in a small number of neighborhoods in Manhattan or Los Angeles, there would be a European deli where you would buy foods that were different from other people. But otherwise, everybody went to Safeway, and the richest guy in town and a middle-class person, sure, had the same food for their barbecue on Saturday afternoon. Whereas today, they shop in different stores, and people bought their clothes at Macy's or J.C. Penney, whereas today they buy different. And so in sector after sector after sector of life, the rich are segregating themselves from the rest. And that also produces alienation and misunderstanding in ways that are very, very damaging to the collective life of a democracy.
So that was going to be my next question, which is what you're describing, and I think we've seen it in other places, that economic disparity often leads to political instability. I mean, again, because of this, Daniel, people can see what other people are doing, right? And so it's not like in the 1960s, I was a white collar guy at the Ford plant and you were a line guy at the Ford plant. We probably made not that much different money, right? You went to college, I didn't. We didn't care. Our kids went to the same schools, right? Now it's you work on the line. I'm a white collar guy. You live near the plant. I live in Grosse Pointe, right? But you can now, my kids can see what your kids are getting to do, and it's not the same thing.
Yeah, it's both that it produces resentments and fears, and also just a lack of sort of understanding and an ability to imagine oneself in shoes that get too different. There are lots of reasons for that. One is just the increased disparity. All right. When the rich get rich enough, they actually do become different. One is lack of interaction. I come from a reasonable amount of privilege, but my high school was not super privileged, and certainly all the kids in it weren't, and certainly my friends weren't. And so, I have friends from my childhood who, had to work jobs when they were 15 to make rent for their family, or who went to prison in one way or another, and not for elaborate financial crimes. And, these are kids I grew up with. I know them, I knew them, I liked them. We trusted one another, and then they had friends who went to college like me, and so each of us could see that in some sense we weren't that different. Whereas once the kids are segregated by income, they won't know anybody who is fundamentally different from themselves economically, and they'll lack an understanding, or just they'll lack the democratic faith that actually we're the same person, just with slightly different circumstances. The other thing that's happened, and here's where the meritocracy is sort of sucking up the luckiest and most talented outsiders is damaging, is it used to be that there were paths that ambitious and talented people took which did not involve betraying their class position. So, if you became a union leader, you stayed a working class person, but you acquired a managerial job, which involved a significant amount of book learning and legal knowledge to do effectively. And now increasingly that person gets a scholarship to a local private school, ends up at Princeton, goes to Harvard Business School, and now they're management,
Right.
right? So we've lost the elite that is not part of the power structure, but that's oppositional to it, but that's very important for holding the society together.
Let me ask you this. How do we avoid to think about this in the context of, something pretty dark, 1984, right? Where the party controlled the elite and the proles were allowed to do as they would so long as they understood their place in the world, and no one really worried about them. How do we reverse engineer that so that, again, you don't have to get a college degree to have a life? You don't have to worry about the idea of, I didn't go to college, I'm not part of the elite, therefore I'm going to rent for life, I'm going to be job to job. I mean, this seems to be, I don't want to say intractable, but it doesn't seem to be an easy path to forge.
No, I don't think it's an easy path. One piece of hope, particularly for the United States, is that we are one of the very few societies in human history that has got ourselves out of a mess like this before. In 1929, income concentration at the top in the United States was as great or greater than it is today. And we managed to unwind it, and we managed to unwind it largely peacefully, without a revolution, without a lot of domestic political violence. And, maybe we got lucky. Maybe it has something to do with the structure of our government, our federalism. Maybe it has to do with the American social and political character. But we've gotten ourselves out of it before, and that's a reason to have some hope that we can get out of it again. Another reason to have some hope, and this may sound odd, certainly, my own private politics are relatively far left. I'm dismayed by the current president and his administration. But it is also the case that one thing Donald Trump has done is he's been part of a movement in American life in which a whole bunch of people are starting to see certain things clearly that they did not see clearly before. They're starting to see economic inequality as being as great as it is. They're starting to be aware that economic privilege excludes lots of people from meaningful opportunity. They're starting to see corporate power. It's interesting that one of the most popular Biden administration officials in the new Trump administration, they didn't keep her on, was Lena Khan,
Sure, of course.
right? Who was the anti-monopoly aggressive enforcer of antitrust policy.
Right. There were Republicans on Capitol Hill that called themselves conservatives.
Exactly. And so what's going on right now in our government is brutal and malign power is being used to brutalize some very vulnerable people. And it's a moral disgrace. And it's a huge cost to our civilization. But at the same time, it's connected to a series of consciousness raising and coming into an understanding of the structural situation that we're in. And I don't think we can get out of it without people's coming to see that. And it'll be an interesting question whether we can generate a politician who has the ability to draw up this growing recognition and move it towards the light rather than towards darkness.
I would say this is, I think you're right. about Trump, and I think he, as I've said on other shows, I think he felt this personally because although he came from some fair amount of privilege, he was always the guy from Queens. The people in Manhattan were never going to accept him. The true elite were never going to have this interloper, right? And of course, he manifested all sorts of ways to show that he didn't really care, and it was all based on insecurity. But here's my question for you. If the awfulness of Donald Trump and his willingness to call out, look, you're getting screwed, and people saying, I know. Can today's Democrats or liberal or left politics get out of its own elite way, Daniel, and go back to being the people of the middle class, the working class, the everyman? Because that's not, frankly, who they are now. And I think that's why so many of their voters who should show up aren't.
Yeah. So can they do it? It's like a complicated question in the following sense. Do the underlying values of the small d Democratic wing of the Democratic Party light a path to doing what you're asking? I think the answer is clearly yes. Will the Democrats have the political skill and leadership to do it? I don't know. If I knew the answer to that question, I would be in a different job. Right? Like, I'm not a politician, but my view is that here's what a Democrat should say right now. They should be, on the one hand, proudly and openly anti-authoritarian and anti-Trump. And on the other hand, they should begin their campaign by thanking the people who voted for Trump, by saying, look, y'all saw something that the rest of us, including my fellow Democratic elites, did not see. You saw that there was a system of exclusion in our society and that it was destroying the middle class and forgetting a lot of Americans. And in a way, you saved the country by voting in a way that made that apparent and undeniable. And then I think the politicians should say, now please save the country again, because the fact that Trump saw that as the problem does not mean that he now sees the solution. And so the same thing you saw before, use that insight to vote for me now, because I'm going to solve this problem, which you correctly pointed out. And that guy isn't, because he doesn't care.
Right. Which, as we see almost every day. All right, Daniel, before we let you go, what else are you working on, and where can our folks find you online?
So I am not very online.
Oh, perfect. Good for you.
So you probably can't find me much online. Probably there are YouTube videos of things I've done or said. Right now I'm working on a big new book called The Good Life After the Age of Growth. So if you think about economic growth, there are two common views out there. One is that economic growth is great. It's always been great. It's always going to be great. And if we can just be smart enough technologically, we can keep growing forever. And the other view is that economic growth has from the beginning been malign and connected to empire and slavery and the worst forms of capitalism. And it was a terrible idea from the start. And the idea behind this book is that both of those views are wrong, that growth was an enormous practical and moral achievement for our civilization. As recently as 1820, roughly 80% of the world's population lived on less than $2 a day. Now, fewer than 10% do. And that growth as a moral ideal and as an economic phenomenon got us out of misery and deprivation. But that while growth is an incredibly valuable and impressive ideal, it has a shelf life and it's reaching its best before date. And the problems that growth used to solve, growth is now making worse. These are ecological problems, they're problems of social discord, they're problems of spiritual despair. And so growth is going to end in the next 50 to 100 years. And we need to start preparing now with what is the ideal going to be that's going to organize our lives in the age after growth. What should we aspire to? How should we live when we're not trying to constantly produce more and more stuff, which is increasingly useless and even destructive? And that's the question the book's going to try to answer.
I think it goes right along with the problem that your first book pointed out, and I think our conversation here too. Daniel, thank you so much for coming today. Guys, as always, you can find me on Twitter and TikTok and says us at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. As online as Daniel is, I am online. Daniel Markovits, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thank you so much, and thanks for a wonderful conversation. I hope people enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And everybody else, we'll see you next time.